Okay, hi everyone. My name is Provides. I'm currently a lecturer at the Bartlett School of Architecture, UCL. So I'm very happy to share with you on the topic of urban co-creation as design education. So as you probably know, the co-creation has been increasingly used as an approach of experiential learning, where students are being taken into the real world, working with local communities to gain experience in real-world projects. So it provides a number of benefits. First of all, today's political, social, and economic landscape is super complex, so working in the real world can help students to better prepare themselves for it. However, it also creates a dilemma that if you engage student in real world project, it blurs the line between laboring and learning. Also in architecture, we were trained to praise hard work. We were trained to work overnight, and sometimes it's romanticized when you're doing free work for other people. And so this basically accelerates students' volatile position of potentially being exploited. And I intend to analyze this tension through the concept of immaterial labor. Now, immaterial labor was defined as the effective and cognitive laboring done uniquely in our information age. So the definition is by such that the generation of knowledge and data are facilitated by technology in architecture, computer-aided design. And second is the emotional elements of work, such as human interaction and care. And so in a co-creative process, we can see that students are simultaneously engaged in both, which means that it forms a volatile employer-employee relationship between their teachers. And I intend to prove my thesis through two paradoxes. First is how we define immaterial labor versus experiential learning. And second is how we define volunteering work from unpaid work. Now, in the first paradox, what I try to do is that I map what kind of work was actually done in architecture. You ideate, you visualize, you communicate with team and other stakeholders, and all of these were indeed done by students in a co-creative process. And so here, design laboring and education of design are deeply entangled. In the second paradox, in countries like US, they have very clear definition of what is volunteer work. For instance, it shouldn't create productive commodity for the laborer. It shouldn't allow employees to be displaced by the volunteers. However, in contexts like Hong Kong, where I came from, there are actually no explicit law that regulate volunteering work, which means that if you don't protect yourself and know your laboring rights, then your right could be out the window. And when a teacher is in a employee-employer relationship with their students, this is similar to the hierarchy of hell by Gernsback. What you basically see is that the student has to ensure their own rights by exhaustive means of asking questions by themselves, collecting evidence, and so forth. And if you really can't find a solution, you can go to your peers, you can go to your teacher, but most likely because of hierarchy relationship, these sources are not available for students to get help. And so I intend to illustrate this theory through a real-world case study. It's qualitative, and I found a co-creation workshop in Hong Kong over 3 months. I interviewed the stakeholders, including the organizer, who is also a teacher, the facilitator, who was the formal employee of the teacher, and also students who are the volunteering facilitator in the process. And the scope was by 3 objectives. First, I would like to understand how the execution and the perceive of that execution are actually aligned. Second, I wanted to understand whether the volume and nature of work could actually define that as unpaid work or volunteering work. And finally, to analyze the overall quality of the product being put on the table. And the result will be 3 stories, 2 paradox, and 1 framework. Let's go to story 1. The blueprint of good intention. This one was actually a story told from a perspective of the organizer, that they truly believe if students go in a real world and work with elderly, they will break the stereotype that were told by books. But then their learning comes from their engagement. So the higher you commit your time, the more you can learn from the process. And with that, they also found a tension that university students, especially in architecture fields, are super tight with time. And so they find it super difficult to find an active agent who can lead the process so that the co-creation can sustain itself. The second story is the delicate engine coming from student as a main force of production. They were actually very appreciative of being able to work in the real world. A lot of students came from mainland, and so for them, it's very lucky that they get to interact with local Hong Kong people. But at the same time, they were sometimes asked not to speak so they can leave more time for residents to express their needs. And so that actually minimized their co-creative interaction with residents. At the same time, final review, we all know how tight the time is. And so in order to do volunteering at the same time that final review, they sometimes have to work really late into the night, and that could affect their well-being. And in a final story, the facilitator also agreed that if students can take on more active roles to facilitate a process, their learning can be maximized and their point of actually being there would also be maximized. Actually, time tight is not unique to students. It was also for the organizers as well. They were only given 4 months by the client to go from planning to the final delivery, and all the workshop has to happen in between. So everyone has to compromise interaction and quality because of time pressure. And so, what can we actually learn from this? The first thing I think we can learn is about the process. What they use is so-called design thinking sprint. So you go from ideation, prototyping, evaluation, a whole process. However, this also affected how the cookie cutter application increased the pressure of participant in the process. For instance, they had to do a physical prototype. This was an image generated by the AI, so participant identity are protected. And from what you can see is a whole set of furniture that has to be done within half a month. And so you can imagine how everyone could be stressed by this cookie cutter application of the design thinking sprint. And because of this, I think there's a three lack in this. First, lack of ownership of the process. Second, lack of autonomy of the product. And finally, lack of authorship of the labeling process. And this is reflected in the stories. The second finding is coming from triangulating stakeholder perspective. So you can see in paradox one, it was difficult to identify immaterial labeling versus learning. And this was shown also in the transcript that organizer frame involvement as pedagogical agent, but it also limited students' autonomy in the process because they're only volunteering. And for facilitator, they recognize there's a lot of potential for student to lead, but then again, student doesn't have that much time to actually get involved. And so the gray area between laboring and learning was created because of this normative planning of the process. And then the second was how we define volunteering work from unpaid work. As student commitment is voluntary, so their exchange actually based on their engagement level. If we consider pivoting this to high school students and more integrated into their curriculum, then maybe they don't have such large clashes in their timetable, and then their workload constraint can be elevated. At the same time, how we understand the value of student contribution is also very important because that truly defines whether the product was benefiting the employer or benefiting the student themselves. One of the key was to think about who gets the authorship of the final product. Is it the teacher who get the authorship? Is it the client who get the authorship, or is it the student? In the current copyright law, there's no clear definition. It totally depends on an individual's ability to collect evidence to prove their copyright. And so we can imagine how this puts students at the same time in a volatile position. And so in the final finding is the prototype. As you can see, I've actually listed out the 7 different things the student had to deliver among the 2-month process: site and user analysis, hand sketch of ideas, image visualization, digital design, 3D modeling, trial mockup, physical prototyping, and presentation panels. So it's similar to what you would do in an office. However, the quality is of students. So to the teacher, the quality isn't good enough as an employee product, but for the student, they dedicated that much time to actually create those products. And so that creates ambiguity over how that relationship is defined. And in the end, I intend to create actionable insights so we can follow these principles if anyone wishes to engage in co-creation initiative. I think the most important thing was to make sure there's a dual alignment between interest and social. So interest alignment really consider how teacher and student interests are actually aligned on the same level, at the same time communicated to each other clearly before the work actually starts. So it was similar to a legal definition. If unpaid work was agreed before the work actually starts, then you cannot complain about it that it's unpaid. However, most of these times, these interest alignment weren't being communicated ahead of time. And so that creates a situation where individuals' boundaries were not drawn. And I think we need to do it through human-centric program design, prioritizing education value, and foster student-led engagement. But at the same time, we have to pay attention to time constraint to make sure that we're not overriding that. And the second alignment is social alignment. Actually, it has to ensure equitable contribution, it has to mitigate hierarchical dynamics, and it has to implement structural guidelines. So most of the times we expect individuals to protect themselves, and we weren't communicating clear enough if they face difficulty, what kind of mechanism they can call for help. And I think these are very important to say, okay, step 1, 2, 3, you need this actionable pathway so that when you are in immense stress or mental well-being issues, these are the methods that you can call for help. So finally, as an active practitioner of co-creative approaches, the motivation of the study is not to criticize any project or any person, but rather I actually want to reflect on my own practice by learning from others. So the finding actually helped to better support designers who believe in participatory discourses, and we're spending so much time and effort to push it forward. We want to ensure that while we are trying to recenter marginalized voices, we are not reproducing other forms of marginalized voices. And so I argue that co-creation in architectural education is fundamentally paradoxical, is enmeshed in immaterial laboring. And so recognizing student volunteer as both a service provider and a service recipient is the key point. So this is actually what my own project is about. It used digital game to engage citizens in the creation of public spaces. And in the next step of the project, I intend to experiment with the principle that I propose to see how digital tool actually accelerates or the volatile position or actually help assist students to be stronger in expressing their voices through digital tools. And so if anyone's interested in how we can use AR, VR, and AI to engage citizens in co-creation, welcome to get in touch with me. I'm based in Hong Kong and London at the same time. And we're very grateful for all of the sponsors. At the end of the day, the organizer of co-creation is one of those guys who are pushing inclusive approaches in public space design. And so I hope that we can all support this journey, but at the same time, be more aware of the ethical dilemma in these sort of complex projects. So thank you, everyone.